Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to day 2 of the ACUR ANU 2021 conference. I'd like to start this morning's session by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay respect to the elders past and present. With 26 separate events taking place over the course of yesterday, we enjoyed a vast wealth of insights from a diverse range of student presenters and distinguished guests. Presentation topics traversed across many research areas, including astrophysics, environmental conservation, and psychological well-being, to name a few. We're excited to continue the conference with another packed day of stimulating events from our talented student presenters and guests. This morning, it's my pleasure to introduce today's keynote address speaker, Professor Alex Zafiroglu, who is Professor and Deputy Director of the School of Cybernetics at the Australian National University. Professor Zafiroglu began her research career as an undergrad archaeology and anthropology student, followed by postgraduate research on punk subcultures and mobile telephony. She joined ANU's 3A Institute in 2019, following a long career in research and development at Intel Corporation, focused on cyber physical systems and the Internet of Things. She's currently a member of the Australian Academy of Sciences National Committee for Information and Communication Sciences and the Ethnographic Praxis in Industry Executive Board, holding 11 patents. Professor, we're very fortunate to have you here. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us this morning.
Thank you so much, Lucas, for the wonderful introduction. I'm super happy to be here today. Let me just get my screen sharing going and confirm that everything looks the way that it should look to you. I can go full screen. Lucas, can you confirm that you can see just my screen?
Confirmed, I can see it.
Confirmed. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me today. I wanted to start as well with an acknowledgement of country. I want to pay my respects to the elders past and present of the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting and in which I am broadcasting this keynote, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and to acknowledge that we are a land that is always sacred and never ceded and has been the location of innovation and responsibility for country for 60,000 years. I also want to start off by congratulating all of you who are attending this conference. This is a really exciting time. You have done undergraduate research, and we are here to celebrate that and to hear about what you've been doing. And I also want to point out to you that this is where it all starts for you. This is really the beginning of your research journey. You've completed that first kind of ring that I'm showing here of full research, from figuring out what your questions are, why they are important, how you would go about answering them, and doing the collecting the data, doing the analysis, and figuring out the best way to present it to the audiences that you have. That is an extraordinary accomplishment and is just the first of many that you will have as researchers in your career. Because I really see undergraduate research as where it all begins and where your journey begins as researchers. And no matter if you go into postgraduate research or you go straight into another job, and stay there, or go through many jobs, or go back to postgraduate education, this is really where it all starts, and you've made a tremendous start. And what I wanted to do today was to give you 4 experiences or 4 stories that I hope will fortify you on your journey. And these 4 experiences are rooted mainly in my own experience. And I'm choosing to do this just to say that things take time, and your research journey is only beginning, and the ways that you will grow as a researcher over time are many and varied. And also to give you a little bit of perspective of how you might think about consciously and mindfully thinking about where it is that you want to be a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, etc. So to start, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my research journey. I know that Lucas told you a little bit about it, but I'm going to put a bit of a framework around it and see where it is that we land. I studied anthropology and archaeology and history as an undergrad. I am the clearly American accent, the American child of 2 immigrants to the US. My mother is Swedish and my father is ethnic Greek, although he grew up in Istanbul. And I was one of 4 children, third of 4 children, and we all went to the local state school, as we called it in the US. I went to school about 20 miles, I'll say that in miles because it was in the US, from my parents' house. And when I went to university, I thought, archaeology is it. I'm going to be an archaeologist. And I started off as an undergrad studying anthropology and studying archaeology. And I spent every summer doing research with the archaeology group in my department. And you can see me here on the right wearing a t-shirt that is saying something not so nice about white males, no idea what it says, standing in a privy. So I'm standing at the bottom of the privy, an old toilet, and my friend Dan and colleague Dan up there is standing at the top. Dan ended up being a professional archaeologist and I did not. But at the time I was in love with archaeology. It was the only thing that I wanted to do. I had a great deal of fun doing it, had a great deal of learning and a great deal of patience doing everything from creating maps of sites to deciding where we're going to be digging test pits to doing feature excavation, taking detailed notes, cleaning artifacts, labeling artifacts, analyzing artifacts, etc. And it turns out there are a few problems with this plan. And at the age of 19 and 20, what I didn't have was a lot of super patience for detailed work. So one day when I was digging a test pit, which was, I think, if I recall correctly, it was 6 feet by 6 feet. And we were basically sampling across the site to see a potential site to see what was potentially there. And my advisor walked up to me and I'm like crouched in this hole with a trowel trying to make the wall straight. And he said, "Alex," and he smirked because he wasn't a particularly nice man. He smirked and he said, "Alex, what are you doing there? Are you digging a bathtub?" And it took me about 5 seconds to realize what he was doing, which was insulting me, because when you dig a test pit, you're supposed to be completely straight walls. And I was clearly not so adept at digging straight walls. The other thing that I could never quite get right was the attention to detail, to making sure I knew what I was looking for. So sometimes there were things like fish scales. They're very tiny and very small, and making sure that you don't destroy the thing that it is that you're looking for takes time and patience. And I realized there were things that I loved about archaeology and things that I didn't. And the things I loved about archaeology still stay with me still. The best thing that I loved about it was that it's a puzzle, and that you don't have all of the pieces, but that you are trying to figure out and make sense of what you are seeing. You're trying to extrapolate from those fish scales, from that tiny piece of iron, from that chipped piece of quartz, what happened in the past from the contents of that privy that I'm standing in. And it was that sense making that I enjoyed, much less than the collection methods, the creation of the data. And the second thing I loved about it was that it was tangible, and that it has to do with people, and that it has to do with what we in the 1990s called material culture, the kind of stuff that we populate into our lives and the tools that we use, the objects that surround us, the built environments that we create, and what that tells us about how we think about the world and how we act in the world and their sets of values and beliefs. And that excited me. And material culture was really just a way of expressing the things that make us human. And so I went on from there to do other types of undergraduate research. This is when in my questioning archaeology phase, And I was wondering if archaeology really was it, that I loved the people part of it and the puzzle part of it. I was not so keen on the methods part of it. And so I ended up doing honors work with a professor in the Department of History who was studying works progress administration images from the photographic core in the 1930s. As you know, in the 1930s, the Great Depression, the American government set up a variety of programs to keep people employed, including doing things like building national parks, but also documenting the effects and the impacts of the Great Depression, as well as communities around the country that normally were not part of the documentary record. And here is an example of some of the work that I was doing. These are images from the American South, and there were just hundreds and hundreds of these images that I was helping to catalog and to pull out the ones that the professor was going to work on, and also doing analysis. And this one was the words that went with it that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me and piqued my curiosity were, quote, two men passing a young baby through a hoop to cure the, quote, stretches, which are caused, according to Negro superstition, by a woman who is menstruating, picking up a young baby. The young baby must be passed through the hoop each morning for 7 consecutive days. Now, of course, this is a particular type of artifact from a time and place with a whole set of assumptions in the words that are getting used to describe what is happening here. And that was one level of the analysis. The other level of analysis was really just understanding what are local beliefs about healthcare, but also what were local living conditions like in the South during the Depression. And so I ended up doing quite a bit of research looking not just at what stretches were, which it turns out is rickets, which is a deficiency of vitamin C, but also looking at all of the objects behind the people and the way that the homes were being insulated and being decorated. And that to me was the beginning of thinking that it was people that I was interested in, and living ones, or at least recently living ones, rather than the ones that were long past in the archaeological record. And from there, I went on to grad school, where I was still interested in stuff and how people use stuff. I was interested in old stuff and new stuff. And then eventually I started thinking beyond the things, beyond the material culture, to the systems behind it. I did 2 things of research. The first was research on punks, punk rockers, hardcore kids, as we called them, in Washington, D.C. In the early 1990s, who identified as straight edge, which was a subculture of the punk movement in which, and I call them kids because they call themselves kids, but they're really youth, anywhere between, say, 12 and 24 usually, who abstained from alcohol, from drugs, from tobacco. At that point, they were increasingly vegan as a means of distinguishing themselves from mainstream adolescents who they saw as being kids who drank and used drugs and didn't treat each other particularly nicely. And so there I was interested in alcohol and youth, and what does alcohol or not using alcohol tell us about youth subcultures. And then my dissertation research, as Lucas mentioned, was around mobile telephony in Sweden. And I was interested in how we told stories about technology and nationalism, about ethnicity and about culture, and who makes technologies and who doesn't. And here you're seeing an excerpt from a children's storybook from the 1990s in Sweden, where you have a traditional red Falunröd house, so traditional farmhouse painted with very old red paint, traditionally associated with a mining region in Sweden, and an old man sitting on the toilet, and a young man with the new Sweden holding a mobile phone and driving a Volvo, who is getting a phone call and telling the older man that he has a phone call. And the old man comes out and he takes a phone call, but of course he still has toilet paper hanging out the back of his trousers, and creating a wire or a line to the past in contrast to kind of new Sweden that is wireless and technology and new. And in this sense, I was interested in what it would mean to have new technologies that were crossing the globe and were supposedly making time and space collapse, because that was the language of the 90s, that we're all going to be one global world and that place and time would no longer matter, and what were the stories that we told about that. And increasingly what I realized is that it wasn't the phone. I mean, the phone is kind of how I got into the research. I'm like, what do people do with phones and what is a phone? But the research, the dissertation research was on mobile telephony. And mobile telephony isn't the phone, it's the systems behind the phone that make conversation and make connection regardless of time and place possible. So after I did that, I went on and realized, aha, the thing that I was really interested in were cyber physical systems, and not stuff and not things per se, but collections or systems of things that come together to produce particular ends. And these systems have both physical and digital components. So I spent 15 years at Intel Corporation. I worked in advanced R&D labs and I worked in product groups. I did a little bit of everything, thinking 10 years out to what the future would hold and what we should be thinking about building and coming up with requirements for those, as well as working in product groups where we had a product coming out in the next 1 to 3 years. And I was doing the correct research to make sure that the things that we were building actually made sense in the world and would have value to Intel's customers and into Intel's customers and users. Intel, of course, is an ingredients manufacturer, so do not sell directly to consumer, but sell to other companies that then build products for consumers. And at Intel, I was doing research to think about what does compute look like when it is no longer a destination, when it is no longer a thing that you go to, like a laptop or a desktop or a tablet or a mobile phone, but it becomes part of the environment around you and in the environment in which you are living and working and doing various activities. And so I did quite a bit of research on smart homes, or the home in general, in domestic spaces. I did work on autonomous vehicles and intelligent transportation systems, because again, the point wasn't the car and the car moving. The point was to think about what are the operating environments in which those work, what other types of systems do they depend on, including things like insurance and traffic management and light systems and taxation and tort law, etc. Like everything that goes into thinking about transportation. And in the home, I was thinking not about how can we make a home smart, but rather what are the activities of daily life that happen in a home? What makes a home a particular type of built environment? And what are the types of roles and the types of things that people do in homes? And then to think not just about that home in isolation and sticking a bunch of sensors in it and like what could you do with a bunch of sensors in a home, which really isn't all that interesting a question, but rather what are the things that people want to do and do not want to be doing? What is it that they value and how do we support that? And how do we always and already start to think about the home as a particular place in a wider system? That the activities that happen in our homes do not exist in a vacuum. And then if we are going to build new experiences for people, we need to be thinking about the environmental, political, social, economic conditions of the 21st century, and not just about, can I say something to a smart home device and have it tell me the time or something like that. And so I ended up being the chief user experience architect for the smart homes at Intel, meaning I drove the user experience vision for what a home was and what a home wasn't, that then filtered down and influenced our product roadmaps. And I did that for quite a while. And in 2019, I joined the ANU. I made a big change and still trying to get there. And I joined the 3A Institute, which was an innovation institute within the College of Engineering and Computer Science. We have now, as of January 4th turned into the School of Cybernetics. And I am now looking at everything that I've been doing over the past 20 years and thinking, aha, I begin to see how these things come together. Cybernetics has its roots in another period of great upheaval following World War II, with the rise of the nuclear age and this feeling that things were irrevocably changing in much the same way it feels with COVID and with climate, the climate change happening, the results of climate change being increasingly visible around the world. We are entering a similar period of change, and the new cybernetics that we're reinvigorating is really about how do we think about systems that work together and creating change in the world that supports holistically a livable planet, technology systems that work for people and for other species, and putting into balance research and development of systems that balance people, technology, and environment. And by environment, I also want to include here other species. Originally, cybernetics is thought of as the science of control and communication. And I always have a little bit of a, what do we mean by control? Control for me and for the original cyberneticians was not about a relationship of one actor having complete power over another, but rather how do different actors within a system and beyond a system communicate with each other and create possibilities through the act of communication and through the act of acting in the world and having feedback loops and other ways of exerting change on each other. So really, we're reinvigorating this type of systems research, and we're doing it in two ways. We're thinking broadly about cybernetics and a cybernetic lens on the world, and that's really the theory part of it. And one of the practice parts of it, of course, is thinking about cyber-physical systems, so these systems that include both digital and physical components, and also very often exhibit behaviors of autonomy or autonomous systems, and thinking about how we safely, sustainably, and responsibly scale cyber-physical systems in the 21st century. So we're thinking about things like, and working on things like autonomous mining. We're thinking about all sorts of applications of AI in different sectors, including the GLAM sector, including research sector, including finance, and of course, in the built environment, including buildings and commercial buildings and homes. So what I want to point out now is that throughout my journey, I've had a few people, a few really influential thinkers that keep popping up. These are people that I come back to again and again, and I think, aha, you know, what would Margaret Mead do, or what would Margaret Mead say? And of course, the first ones of these is Margaret Mead. For those of you who do not know who Margaret Mead is, I will show you a picture of her and my first experience with her when I was younger. This is a young Margaret Mead. If you ask someone, particularly in the United States, to name an anthropologist, the person they're probably going to come up with is Margaret Mead. When I was beginning my journey as a researcher, as an undergrad, Margaret was just kind of there. She was the person that you read, and you couldn't study anthropology and get away from her. So my first exposure at that point was a book that she titled Coming of Age in Samoa. It was published in 1928. In it, she details the lives of young Samoan women, basically what we would call adolescents. And she writes about what their lives were like, with a particular desire to contrast how they lived with the experience of teenagers in the US. So while the study is really about Samoan society and really about a small community of about 600 people on the island of Ta'u, and I apologize if I mispronounced that, Really, it's a study about the universality of life stages and what it means to move from childhood to adulthood and how this is experienced and expressed differently in Samoa and the US. And the question here isn't really so much if she got it right, if she got her argument right. It was more that she opened up the possibility for me to think about life stages as more than just individual psychology, that everyone has their own life journey, and more than universal, that everybody kind of goes through the same stages no matter where you are in the world. And when I was doing research on those straight edge kids in DC, the ones that swore off alcohol and drugs and cigarettes and things like that, Margaret Mead's work was really helpful for framing my argument. And so that was the first time I encountered her. And then later on, I encountered her again. And so you saw a young Margaret Mead, you saw a young me, you're seeing an old me now. Here is Margaret Mead a little bit later in her life. She turns out, and I thought, oh, Margaret Mead's great. And it was only later that I realized what an important figure she was. She wrote everywhere and worked with everyone. She had a column in Red Book, which was one of the big women's magazines of the mid-20th century in the US. She was a founding member of the Cybernetics movement in the 1940s. She was fiercely interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. She was a founding member of the Society for Applied Anthropology, which I like to just think of as a society of anthropology. And applied here meaning, of course, working in contexts outside of academia. And she was really saying, we have a responsibility in the world through research to understand what is happening and to do our best to make the world a better place. And I have two quotes from her that inspire me to this day. The first is about the importance of being transdisciplinary in your research approach, of not getting stuck in one way of doing things or one way of answering a question, but of being open to new things. And I found this was super important to me as a researcher at Intel, because I was trained as a social scientist. I was surrounded by computer scientists and engineers, and it often took us a few meetings to understand what each other were saying. That we were using what we thought was common English and really meaning very different things. Engineers and computer scientists would love to tell me about ground truth. And then I would say, don't believe in ground truth. And then we'd have an argument until we understood ground truth from a computer science perspective and what they were trying to express with that. And my reaction to ground truth, as all knowledge is always filtered through the lenses that we bring to it and our limitations as human beings in knowing the world. But the quote that always makes me think of those meetings is one that she talked about for the founding of cybernetics in the 1940s at the Macy's conferences. She said there were three groups of people there. There were the mathematicians and the physicists, people trained in the physical sciences who were very, very precise in what they wanted to think about ground truth. There was a small group of us, anthropologists and psychiatrists, who were trained to know enough about psychology and groups so we knew what was happening and could use it and disallow it. And then there were two or three gossips in the middle, who were very simple people who had a lot of loose intuition and no discipline to what they were doing. In a sense, it was the most interesting conference I've ever been in because nobody knew how to manage these things yet. And I find that really inspiring and lovely. And I want you to think about in your research journey, how you create bridges with other people and what you will get out of that as a researcher by being open to different perspectives and listening to your peers. And just because you may not at first understand someone's point of view, doesn't mean you can dismiss their methods, you can dismiss their way of looking at the world, but really lean into that. And the other thing that also inspires me from Margaret Mead is her quote of, if the future is to remain open and free, we need people who can tolerate the unknown, who will not who can work without the support of completely worked out systems. And that has inspired me as well, because I think that's really the world that we're living in now, that we've left the idea that we can control everything, and if we just know everything, we can make things work the way that we want, but that we live in a post-Cartesian, complicated and complex world. And she's pointing to that and saying, we need to be flexible and we need to be open. The second person who really inspires me is a fellow named Buckminster Fuller. I don't know if any of you have heard of Buckminster Fuller, but he is a little bit of a character, and I will tell you about my experiences with him now. I first came across Buckminster Fuller, and let me tell you, this is a difficult picture to find. This is from Wikipedia of Bucky, as he is known, famous for his geodesic domes and his buckyballs, those magnets that we may all have had as kids to play with. Buckminster Fuller, I first heard of him when I took a break from graduate studies for a year between my master's studies and my PhD studies. And I found myself living in an apartment, a studio apartment with my partner who was studying literary criticism in Philadelphia. Do not ever recommend living with anyone in a studio apartment while they are doing postgraduate studies. Lesson to you. I needed a job, and I found one at the World Game Institute, the Buckminster Fuller Institute, which is an organization devoted to educating people in the perspectives of Bucky. Bucky was a serial entrepreneur and a researcher. He, the World Game, as it were, which is what I was working on, was a means of getting people to think about the entire world as a system and the interdependencies about parts of the world, and to think in longer time frames than we are used to thinking. It was my first real exposure to systems thinking, and not to think in pieces or bits or stuff, but to think in systems and to think in really, really long time scales, and of allocating resources and following trends and creating scenarios to see how we could create a peaceful and just world in which the world's resources could sustain human populations today and into the future. He's also really famous because he made the Dymaxion world map, which doesn't distort the world like a Mercator projection. You've probably seen these, they look like tiles. And he was doing that to make a satisfactory deck plan of the 6½ sextillion ton spaceship Earth. In my later years, I came to understand Buckminster Fuller as much for his Dymaxion world maps and the World Game, as well as his geodesic domes. And you'll see a stamp here of him looking like one of the geodesic domes. He was a signer of the Triple Revolution, which was a letter to Congress saying that the kind of triple threats of cybernation, which he was defining as the increased automation, increase of autonomous systems in the world, of weaponry and world war, and of the lack of human rights in the US and abroad in the 1960s, urgently needed to be addressed. He was, in his own way, a cybernetician. And the thing that I want to point out about Bucky is that he had a great deal of to offer the world, and a great deal of energy to think about how we, through research and how we, through really critical thinking, can make a world that we all can thrive in. He had these ideas in the 60s around being able to take care of everyone on Earth at a higher standard of living than has ever been known before. He had these plans where he thought if we could just account for all of the resources on the Earth, make a total accounting of them, we could then redistribute them more justly. And now we can kind of think that's an impossible task. The way that we think about change, the way that we think about complexity now doesn't really fit with that way of thinking. But what's inspirational about him is that rather than sitting around and thinking, wouldn't it be nice if we figured out how to do things, he went out and he did it. And the quote that I always think of from him is that you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, you need to build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And that is certainly what he did. And then the third person that I want to introduce you to, if you're not familiar with him, is Stewart Brand. He is the only one of these three people that is still with us. And he is also a cybernetician. So for Stewart, here is a young picture of Stewart Brand, if I can get my thing to go forward. Yes, he does have what looks like to be an LSD tab on his forehead. It was the 1960s when this picture was taken. And shamefully, I came to know Stewart Brand only in my 30s. So if I met Margaret in my teens and I met Bucky in my 20s, I met Stewart in my 30s, as he was the author of a book called How Buildings Learn. And it's a really beautiful book. I highly recommend it. And it's about, from the subtitle, what happens after they're built. And I was reading it as an antidote to all of the ahistorical human-computer interaction literature from the ACM and the IEEE that I was otherwise immersed in when I was thinking about what is a smart home, what is a smart building, what is a smart city, etc. And he was also in his earlier years one of Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters. He was the founder and the publisher of the Whole Earth catalog. He's a cybernetician, and he's the type of researcher that I admire the most. He is in and of the world. He's widely engaged. He asks big questions, and he's writing for everyone. So here, I'm not going to say he's writing for a general audience versus an academic audience. He's writing because he wants to make change in the world, and he's choosing his language in order to reach the largest number of people. And in How Buildings Learn, what inspired me the most were two really simple sentences, and they were, all buildings are predictions. All predictions are wrong. And here it was like, aha, it's not the form or the ideal of the thing that you're building, whether it's architecture or it's a smart home system, but it's about what happens over time and how time shapes worlds and makes some things possible and makes other things impossible. He has a very useful build on Walter Duffy, the architect's idea of sharing layers and how change happens over time. And there are different rhythms and cycles to change over time that interact in complex ways. And in his later years, and you'll see him here today, Stewart's also one of the founders of the Long Now Foundation, which promotes long-term thinking and responsibility in the framework of the next 10,000 years. And that to me was just a little bit mind-blowing. They have a way of getting us to think about what it is that we are doing now and how that is going to affect future generations, because the number of people that will be alive in the world in the future far outnumbers the ones that have been alive in the past or are alive now. And the one quote that I like from him here is, to think about doing the greatest good for the greatest number means doing the longest good, because the majority of people affected is always yet to come. We can do little good for our dead, but immeasurably good or harm to our unborn. So accepting responsibility for the health of the whole planet, we are gradually realizing also means responsibility for the whole future. The worst of destructive selfishness is not me, but me right now. The generous opposite could be the phrased as all of us for all time, presumably including non-humans. Yeah, I come back to Stewart Brand all the time in my work and in my teaching. So I've told you a little bit about my research journey. I've told you about what it means to start off in one place and think you're going to do one thing, and it's like, this is definitely what I'm doing. And to go through lots of different types of research that I've done towards very different ends, and to realize in the end that it creates a little bit of a pattern and a little bit of a story. And of course, this is always easy to do after the fact. It's always easy to say like, aha, I can find the pattern after the fact, which is a little bit silly. But also, it makes me think about what are the things that motivate me and what are the things that I'm curious about in the world, and how I made that work across the past 20 years. And you all are now at the very beginning of your journeys as researchers. And you too will begin to fill out these lines and begin to see that some things are a little bit off to the side and not connected. But there's accretion of the work that you do over time, and you will begin to understand what those things are. There's a apocryphal quote from Einstein, and of course it really wasn't Einstein, it was really just a quip from the 1980s, if you dig enough on the internet and find this out, that says, we wouldn't call it, if we knew what we were doing, we wouldn't call it research. And I do want you to keep that in mind, that doing research means being open to new possibilities. It means not necessarily knowing what you're doing, but figuring it out along the way. Of course, it is rigorous. Of course, there are rules around it and best practice. But if you knew the answer already, you wouldn't be doing research. So as you go out and start your research journey, and you think about what your journey will be and who those people or what those ideas are that you will carry with you throughout your research career, I want to have you think a little bit about what questions motivate you and what's your leitmotif. What are the ideas or the people that you will become back to over and over again? You may not realize it for a while, but it will emerge. And to think about how you're going to change and how you're going to grow and what you're going to retain over time. And also to allow yourself to change and allow yourself to grow, and to realize that if the research that you're doing isn't working for you, go off and do something else for a while and come back to it. I also want you to be able to pull on these threads for yourself and to be able to consider how your research journey is going to unfold, and to think back on this in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, or 20 years, and think about what shaped you as a researcher. And with that, I will say thank you. I'm happy to take any questions that you have. I'm also happy to follow up. You'll see my email address at the bottom of the screen. I'm always happy to talk to students, and always happy to tell you about the School of Cybernetics if you decide that you want to do postgraduate work with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, for sharing the insights you've gained from your fascinating research career, particularly on the foundational role that undergraduate research plays in shaping our careers and broader trajectory in life by allowing us to explore different rabbit holes of curiosity and realize the types of questions that we want to ask and in what disciplines. Yeah. So thank you once again, Alex.
You're welcome.
At present, I can't see any questions in the Q&A. So unless some roll in the next minute, we might wrap it up there. So yeah, I guess thank you also to all of our conference attendants. Yeah, sorry.
People can follow up with me via email. I'm always happy to do that.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you also to all of our conference attendees who are in the audience this morning. We hope you have a wonderful day ahead and make the most of the conference's events by attending as many sessions as possible. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.